The addition of Elden Ring to the From Software catalog retroactively added an interesting dimension to the worlds of the previous games. Dark Souls has a very cleverly interweaved map with many different pathways you can take to progress, especially if you obtain the Master Key. However, you would be hard pressed to describe its map as an open world, at least in terms of how we understand them today. Upon further examination, even games in the same Dark Souls series vary wildly in terms of freedom of choice you are provided to proceed through their worlds. But even on the other side of the board, not all games with genuine open maps are created equal. There are certainly some that are much more vast and expansive than others, along with varying amounts of freedom to explore them at your own pace. Indeed, the expanse of the map and the freedom of choice and movement through that map are both immensely influential factors that determine the openness of a game. All of this has led me to believe in the last few years that the open world phenomenon is indeed a sort of spectrum, rather than having to meet exact, defined parameters. With this in mind, if seen through the lens of the spectrum, how will the Soulsborne games compare to each other, and a few other different series, in terms of openness? What are the most linear and the most open Soulsborne games? Let's discuss. Now, of course, visual guides would really be handy for this video, but editing all that fluidly would be a pain in the ass. So we're going to do this. We are going to graph out from linear to open where I think every game in the Soulsborne franchise belongs, along with other games I feel will be good for, relative reference to how linear or open they may be. Also, ignore the 18 there. This is my dad saying this dumbass use a permanent. Okay, so naturally we're going to start with the open side of games, and no doubt Elden Ring goes in here, but the thing that's important to mention is where in this graph it goes. Because as I'm trying to display in this video, I feel like openness is kind of a spectrum because not all open world games are the same. They have different philosophies in some regards, that kind of thing. Linear might be a little more straightforward to define, but for openness, well, let's start here. What do I think is the most true to an open world game experience out there so far? I think it would be Breath of the Wild. I think that's the one that pretty accurately captures pretty much every aspect of open world games as we know them right now. It's obviously an open world map. You can literally do as little or as much as you want for it. And it's hard to think of a better example. I mean, Tears of the Kingdom might also be in there. I think the only thing that would go maybe here past that would be maybe something like a sandbox, like Minecraft is the only thing that I can think of, but that's kind of its own thing as well. So in terms of openness, I think Elden Ring falls right about here. As you know, the map is pretty open world in a way. It's not as open as Breath of the Wild because you can't literally go in any direction of it. You start in Limgrave and you're limited to going to Caelid and Liurnia, or staying in Limgrave. You do have to cross Liurnia to get to Altus, and then the underground has its own little segments, that kind of thing. So it's not truly an open world map as much as Breath of the Wild is, and to some degree Tears as well. But you can't really deny that there's a lot of freedom going on still, regardless. And to fully demonstrate what I mean by this, I will be using this upper half as a layout of the world. This is why this is in the lower half. So if we start off with this being the beginning of the map, you have to fight the grafted scion first. Then you kill him or take a death. And then from here, one of the main things you can do is fight Margit. And then go to Godric. But as we all know, you don't have to do that. As a matter of fact, you can even say you don't have to do this at all. You could also go to the Glenstone Dragon, then do the Red Wolf, and then Renala. These two count as two separate demigods, or the Grey Rune, I suppose. You can also go straight to Caelid. You do, on the first playthrough, if you don't do a lot of these things, you have to do Leonine and Crucible. And then you do Radahn. If you're really cuckoo, you can also go and do Volcano Manor and do Godskin Noble into Rykard. And if you're actually insane, you can, if you want to, do Moog as well. As I found out in a video where I had to research all this. For unlocking the yellow fog gate in Lindell. So, for the aforementioned fog gate, you just have to do any 2 of these. And then, I guess you can do this first, but you have to fight Draconic Tree Sentinel. Then from there, you fight Godfrey, at least that gold version. Then from there you fight Morgoth. And then from here you go Fire Giant, Malekith. Well, I guess there's a Godskin duo in there, but you get what I mean. And then, you know, let's see. So you got Gideon and Godfrey again and Rada Beast to beat the game right there at the end. So this right here is a good reason why people consider it open world. There's a good amount of freedom of choice as to which demigod you want to kill to be able to reach Lindell and progress. You can kill at least 2 or do all 5 or however many you want to do. The issue for me when it comes to getting it more this way is definitely this right here. You kind of just get tunneled for the rest of the game, more or less. You can do other things, of course. You can find Melania, you can fight, you know, Moog if you hadn't found them before, whatever. But they all have to go through here if you play normally, without glitches and stuff. So I think this side of it is what does detriment it a little bit for me to be more on this end, and just a little bit more that way. Because if you're to do Breath of the Wild, you can literally go from here to here in like 15 minutes, less with, you know, speed on tactics, whatever you want to do. Or you can do something like this, which is just the Divine Beasts, and go here at the end. And you do get rewarded for it some, but, you know, it's definitely not necessary by any means. I would almost say that shrines are more of a determining factor for something like this if you want to, like, beat Ganon with a reasonable amount of health. Alright, so we're actually not going to go like this and go that way. We're going to double back to linear now and try to find that end of it and work our way to the right again. So over here, I think the games that come to mind the most when it comes to like straight up linear is something like The Last of Us, Uncharted, that kind of thing. I feel like the Metal Gear games fall somewhere in here as well, because those games have more freedom than those linear games. Like, those have some things for exploring too as well, but there's usually a straight path, that kind of thing. Metal Gear has some more freedom to what you can do at any given moment to prepare, or whatever the case. And you do usually have to cross the map more than just in a linear tunnel and stuff like that. Depending on the game, it may go more this way, you know, it depends. But generally speaking, I feel like that's where they average out. So what's the next game I think will go here as pretty much the most linear out of the Soulsborne games, at least? I think it would be, give or take, right there. And the game I think it is Bloodborne. Which potentially, if you are a lover of this game, you may be a little surprised, because I know that, for instance, Dark Souls 1 is genuinely praised for its world design and stuff like that. Bloodborne has some interesting things to its world, but I don't know that it's actually ultimately that open in a sense. And we're going to discover why with a little roadmap. So, you start off. The first mandatory thing you gotta do is kill Gascoigne. Nothing you can do to bypass that. And then there's a little bit of freedom here. You can either kill Bloodstarved Beast and open the side door in Cathedral Ward, or you can do Cleric Beast and get the thing from the store and buy it, and then you can open the way to the Cathedral Ward. Or you fight Vicar Amelia. Now that is just about as open as it gets. Because from here, you go to Shadows of Yharnam, then straight on to CD-ROM, then one Reborn, then Mikolash, then you got Whereas from here you can actually either end the game right here, or you can do Gehrman, And from here, you can get 3 of the 4 chords in the game. There's only one that's really mandatory, which you get from Wet Nurse. And from there, if you get that, you can fight Wind Presence and get the true ending and stuff. But outside of this little segment where you get the chords, you don't really gotta explore much to beat the game. Now, of course, there are segments. Obviously, before Meek Amelia, you got the Witches of Hemwick, you got Hypergen Jail. You can do that later as well. Obviously, it's optional, and even those loads in themselves are a little bit linear, all that kind of thing. So, compared to what we saw with Elden Ring, I hope that this is clear that this is pretty much the diametrical opposite of Elden Ring. And if you ever taken a good look at the map, then that's pretty clear. One thing I find a little bit interesting in terms of the map of Bloodborne is that in the Forbidden Woods, there is a shortcut back to Yharnam. Now, it's kind of useless in terms of the actual game. It's something that always made me think that maybe Bloodborne was intended to not have fast travel at the start at the very least, similar to Dark Souls 1, and maybe they changed their mind a little bit later on. Because it just kind of exists now without real reason. And maybe if it did have no fast travel like Dark Souls 1, it could give off the illusion of it being a more open game. But as it is now, it's really not. It's just a very linear experience that you may not even notice at first. If you explore Witches of Hemwick and you get trapped by Hypogean Jail, you may think it's all more open or something that it really is. But in reality, to complete it, it's definitely a far cry from something like Breath of the Wild, which is not a bad thing, just to be clear. As stated, we're going to go from left to right again. So what comes after Bloodborne in terms of this? So I think with a little bit of a gap, probably around the 18 here, we got Dark Souls 3. That one I feel is a little more straightforward. I think it's pretty clear when people play the game for the first time that it is more linear, but there is more going on to it than Bloodborne in terms of paths you can take and orders of things you go through. So it does give it a little slight edge. So you start off with Eudex Gundyr. From there, you do have to kill Vort. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting. From here, you could technically go all the way to Abyss Watchers straight away. And if you want to, from there you can do Volnir. But here you hit a roadblock right before you can enter into Irithyll. So from Vort, you have to go into Crystal Sage. And after Crystal, you got Deacons of the Deep. And then after you get that, you get the doll that lets you cross that barrier, which means you can from there progress a little bit into the game. Now straight away you get a little bit more of a choice here than you normally do in like Bloodborne. You can either do Pontiff, Sullivan, and then go and do Aldrich for another lore like Abyss Watchers, or you can go into the dungeons to do Yorm. And then once you get both of these, you will get pretty much automatically teleported to Dancer. That's about as far as it goes for the terms of openness, but already you can see that there's a little bit more going on than Bloodborne. Now all of this is technically mandatory so far. As you can see, it has the solid lines as opposed to dashed, kind of like it did for the cleric based segment and all that in Bloodborne. But there is more in terms of the progression needed and stuff like that, to where it gives you more of an option in the route you take. From here, you do have to do Dragon Slayer Armor, then you do Twin Princess, and then you got the good old endgame with Soul of Cinder. So yeah, as I said, more going on in terms of progression. It's a little bit strange because it is mandatory to do all of this right here. There are some segments where you can deviate. So after Dancer, you can do Osiris, which also means that after you get Osiris, you can do Nameless King and all that and the Archdragon Peak. But I think that even in first play, it does appear linear, even on first playthrough, as opposed to Bloodborne, which may feel a little bit more convoluted, but it's really not. Alright, so what's next now? This one might surprise you. Maybe because it's not really a Soulsborne game, but I do think that pretty much dead in the center is Sekiro. So in terms of why it belongs there, I don't know where all of you think this would go at face value, but have already obviously drawn the roadmap ahead of time to know where I fall, it is a little bit interesting, but maybe not as much as you think. Although that said, it is dead in the middle of between open and linear, so it has to have some qualities that give it openness, obviously. So you do start off pretty straightforward. You gotta do the first Genichiro fight right here. Then you have to fight the ogre. I won't be detailing every single mini boss, but some of the major roadblocks I will. Then you gotta get through Kyobu. And then you got the Blazing Bowl pretty shortly after. Now from there is when things get really interesting, but again, maybe not as much as you would expect. So the most straightforward thing to do right after is your rematch with Genichiro. And from there you do need to defeat him and then talk to Ishin to be able to unlock folding screen monkeys. You can do the area before that, but you won't have access to the actual boss because the bell won't be there or whatever. You do also need to beat Genichiro to get the key to the gun fort, which from there leads you to the centipede giraffe dumbass, which from there you can fight Guardian Ape. So these two are the most important to be able to progress, along with Genichiro, guys, to some degree. And then the way to get to the last one, the corrupted monk, that you need to be able to, hit either the ending or progress further. There is a few ways to go. You actually could do it straight after the bowl, not even having done Genichiro yet. You have to kill the snake eyes, in which here from the big drop, by the way. Or you can continue going further from the Guardian Ape area through like the serpent den, I think it was, which I think leads you back right before the snake, which you'd have to kill ultimately. Then you got the Mist Noble. And then from there, you got Corrupted Monk. So this part of the game, in truth, is more dynamic or more open, kind of in the same way as Dark Souls 1 is than you really think just by looking at this. But at the same time, when looking at a roadmap, it doesn't seem much more open than something like Dark Souls 3, I suppose, because you do ultimately got to do these three. And there's a few ways to go about it. And I would say that it's a really cool way to connect the map in this way, because you don't have to do like the drop here at all, or you don't have to go for the fur. You can even do the monk first, before Genichiro, before Guardian Ape, before Folding Screen Monkeys. But nonetheless, when comparing to something like Elden Ring, obviously it's not nearly as wide open as it is, so that's why it doesn't fall as close as it could if maybe you could literally do all of them in any order. And if maybe this line wasn't as straight. And the thing is, after that, it also gets pretty straightforward. And last detail is that the connections only really go one way. Like you can drop down to this guy or from here, but you can't really go back without fast traveling too, which is something I also found out in one of my videos. So if you were to connect this world without warping, first of all, it'd be impossible to really do, unless you abuse certain aspects of the game. So it still doesn't hold a candle to something like Dark Souls 1, but it does have some aspects of openness to it. So again, you do have to do all of these to be able to progress. And from here, you got an option. You can either do Emma and Ishin for the sure ending, or you can fight Owl to be able to get the more true endings, I suppose. So from here, you can pretty much just do True Monk, and then you got Divine Dragon, and then you got Ishin for, the rest of the endings. Which, speaking of which, if you want to, you can indeed do Lady Butterfly here into our father. And then from there, you can get the, what's called, the purification ending, I think it was, with Ishin. Then there's also the homecoming one, but that's not really related to bosses. It's more like a quest item type thing with the hearts, the serpent hearts. But you mostly just have to backtrack to some of these areas here. So looking at a map compared to even Dark Souls 2, there is more going on for sure. And there's even some more optional pathways you can do for either the ending or how to get to the monk, corrupted monk. But it still doesn't reach the insane amounts of openness that Elden Ring will get. but it still shares some things. And I think one thing that personally for me was really hype about Sekiro before it even came out is that it was announced that the world will have an interconnection like Dark Souls 1. Does it live up to that in practice? Because of the warping, not really, but it was still a very interesting experience trying to figure out where to go, how to get there, that kind of thing. So yeah, we're definitely getting there. We're getting this way. We're, like I said, pretty much halfway in the thing. I actually think I meant to put Dark Souls 3 more close to it, maybe in between, but you get the gist. It's more about the order than anything. So up next here, I feel like maybe including Sekiro to some degree, this might be the area where there might be the most deviance in what maybe y'all think and I think, because I would honestly put the next 3 or 4, including Sekiro, give or take around the same region, just right next to each other, and you can maybe even interchange some of them. But what I think is next is Dark Souls 2. So I won't deny Dark Souls 2 is quite open, but you'll see as we progress why I think this may be the least out of the next 3 at the very least. So we start out in the beginning, of course. We spawn in, we make our character after we start, which is funny. You can do Last Guardian, which I think is what most people would do first. From there, you can do Pursuer. Then if you take the bird, you can go straight to Ruin Sentinels. And then from there, you got Lost Sinner. And the thing about this is that there actually is a slight deviance in where you can go to get them. That's why it's a dashed line for this. So you can also do Dragon Rider, then do the Flexile Sentry, and then from here you can also reach the Ruin Sentinels, meaning you can get to Lost Sinner from 2 different ways, which is actually pretty good. Now this path is borderline mandatory actually, because you can also get to Skeleton Lords from there, and you kind of have to do that as far as I know, which from there you go through like the Earthen Peak and all that, you get to Covetous Demon, and then from there you got Mitha, and here you can either do Smelter Demon, or you can just gonna go straight into the Old Iron King there, being another of the Lord Souls or whatever, as well as just like Lost Sinner. And then for an actual disconnected path, which you only need a Fragrant Branch to get, you can also do Nashka. Then you can do Prowling Magus, and cap it off with Duxtier Freya, my favorite Night Rain boss. And finally, as long as you buy the Cat Ring, or if you get the ladders from the fucking guy over here or whatever, you can go pretty much straight into Rotten, which I wrote terribly, but you get the gist. And then all of these connect here to be able to reach Drangley Castle. Now this is already pretty solid. You got 4 pathways, give or take, with even some variants in between how you reach them. You can like never touch Last Guardian Pursuer, maybe. Can you skip Last Guardian? I don't think so. I don't remember actually. But either way, you can do all that, or the reason why they're all dashed for the most part is that you can also do the 1 million souls thing, which as someone who has done it one time for experimentation, don't do it. It is something you can do, and most likely than anything than like not doing any of these and just farming like fucking, I don't know, Forest of the Fallen Giants without killing any boss, you'll probably end up doing like a couple of these, and then maybe you just accidentally go into the Drangley Castle or something. My friend Carl actually did this and never saw Freya, so he was confused when he fought her in Night Rain. It was really funny. But either way, even the 1 million souls thing, maybe give it some credit for being on this side of the spectrum rather than that one. But even just looking at this, it's looking pretty good. Maybe looking at this, you could even think it's comparable to Elden Ring and maybe should go right next to it or something. But if you know the game, you probably already know why it's not anywhere near the open world side of it, because it kind of falls apart a little bit here. And in my opinion, at least, in kind of a bad way. It just tunnels for the rest of the game pretty severely. And why, not really spoilers, you can probably assume this, but why I think Dark Souls 1 is maybe a little bit more open than this one. So here you got the double Dragon Riders. I don't believe you can skip them. And then you got the Looking Glass Knight. Then you got Seaman of Dong. You got Guardian Dragon. So from there, you can pretty much just go into Giant Lord once you get the Ashen Mist, Throne Watcher and Defender, and then Nashka as the last boss. Which you can reach the Throne Watcher and Defender with just the King's Ring after this, but Nashka won't appear until you have the Ashen Mist, I think it's called, whatever it is, that gets you into memories and stuff like that, which you do need all the Giant Lords, I guess. Maybe that's what it is. You need the Giant Lords things. And of course, this is all the end stuff, but I believe even in the original like PS3 and release version of Dark Souls 2, that's all DLC related, not part of the base game. So yeah, I think this is the main thing that hampers it a lot compared to the entries coming up, because looks fantastic. I definitely even credit Dark Souls 2. It's not my personal favorite game of the series, but I do think that the beginning openness is pretty solid. I just don't like playing a lot of it, unfortunately. And this line right here, it's pretty bad. Like, you got the Shrine of Amana, you got all this keep and stuff. Look, those two are so like painfully linear, even in the individual levels. That's a little bit, especially all this keep. It's kind of embarrassing how linear it is. Again, not to say it is a bad thing. For me, it doesn't hit as well as other things. It kind of falls in an awkward middle spot where it was incredibly open, and then you get all this keep where it's just a tunnel to the end of the boss. It's like, what? But that's my thoughts, obviously. I still could see someone arguing that this is more open than Dark Souls 1 for reasons. But to me, I do think that Dark Souls 1 is at least a little bit more open. Alright, so slight spoilers, but there's only two left here. We got Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. And I feel like if there's any that's going to be the most controversial take for me personally, it might be this one coming up. Because I think that, albeit right next to it, we got, after Dark Souls 2, this one. Which maybe just saying that makes you realize why I say that. So let's get straight to it. So we got Asylum Demon starting out. After that, we got Taurus Demon. And then from there, you can go straight to Gargoyles. And if you collect the key right before Gargoyles, you can go do Capra Demon, and then Gaping Dragon. And then from there, you do Ke. If you do both of these, you of course unlock Sen's Fortress, and you can proceed to the game. Of course, alternatively, we can get the Master Key and go straight there. The Master Key's presence alone does increase the playability and stuff, replayability, pathways you can take to be able to get to the bosses faster, maybe do them out of order per se. I suppose you can technically do quite like before Gargoyles as well. So obviously starting out doesn't look as strong as Dark Souls 2, but I don't necessarily think it has to start out as open. And we do have a small hallway here, but as you probably know, it doesn't stay like that for long. So here we got Iron Golem, or Instagram, I guess. And then you just got ONS to unlock the Lord Vessel, which clears the fog and opens up the game once again. From here you can do Seath straight away with not much in your way. You can also do Pinwheel straight into Nito, then Sith into 4K resolution, or Ceaseless Discharge, Fire Sage Demon, into Centipede Demon, my second favorite Night Rain boss, into Bed of Crack. But of course, if you got enough humanity, you can also go from Ceaseless straight to Bed of Chaos as well. Which, not an orthodox path, probably won't know about it unless you research it, and unlike they do it in first playthrough. But there is a 4-way path with not even that much intersection between where you can go between it, like that a little bit. But I don't necessarily think that harms it in this context. Once you get all of those, of course, you can beat the game with Gwen. So I don't feel like it might, well actually no, I do think it might be a little controversial putting Dark Souls 1 over 2 in some ways. Because obviously, as I said, the beginning of Dark Souls 2 is really strong with the openness. You could even argue maybe it's more open than this, or gives you more freedom if you want to talk about that side of open world map games rather than the little openness of it or whatever. But I do think because after the single pretty solid open segment of Dark Souls 2, you get tunneled insanely harshly for the rest of the game, more or less. I do think it hampers the openness of it overall. The beginning is really strong, but I do think that starting off a little bit more open, tunneling you only a little bit, and then hitting another more open segment even at the beginning, is a little bit more of a generous curve. It lets you kind of get used to the exploration, and you can even warp at this point after ONS. So I think I would hand it to Dark Souls 1 a little bit more in that regard. But that's not all, actually, because I have a very interesting fact for you. So I've had the idea for this video for, I think, years at this point, and kind of unrelated, it came up with a conversation I had with Illusory Wall for another video I had going on, where I brought up the spectrum of open world, which is obviously a topic I had in mind by then already. And he told me that he recalled that in some marketing elements of Dark Souls 1 originally before release, it was marketed as open world. Now he told me he hadn't found that quite yet at that time, but for this video I actually did go and research something, and what I found is pretty interesting. So what I did to search it is I went pretty much month by month since 2010, before the announcement of the game even was, pretty much just looking for any information, searching by Dark Souls open world, and then afterwards I narrowed it down to Dark Souls world period to help me find the most resources I can and as early as I could. I even searched it under Project Dark, the working title for Dark Souls 1. Sorry, I just realized my camera went out. So the very first mention of the world generally of Dark Souls 1 is something that I couldn't quite find in a Famitsu magazine. I don't know if it was uploaded online, it's not there anymore, or it was only in the magazine. But there was someone who summarized the entries there and described, things about Dark Souls that they just revealed. But in that first magazine, I think it was on February 1st, 2011, it was described that the world was seamlessly connected, unlike the hub areas of Demon Souls. Some English sites like Game Informer reported on it with similar verbiage as well. I believe on February 8th it was, Miyazaki did an interview with 4Gamer, and he was asked if it meant having open fields like in Oblivion and stuff. And he said no, and explained that it's more like a labyrinth connected all together. Something they would have liked to do with Demon Souls, but they couldn't at that time. This is actually really interesting to read, so I will put emphasis on that. I will have all of these articles that I found below, of course. But later that same day, Game Informer had an article that said, as previously announced, Dark Souls will have an open, fully connected world rather than a hub splitting off into individual levels. Now, the verbiage of it doesn't necessarily inherently mean that they meant open world game, kind of like Oblivion, like Red Dead Redemption, who all preceded Dark Souls. But after this, on occasion, both in the community and other outlets, they would start using the term open world. So I think what might have happened is that there was either mistranslation, misunderstanding, or possibly in that open worlds weren't as strictly defined as of yet. Now, games like Oblivion, Red Dead Redemption, Fallout 3, Assassin's Creed existed, but Skyrim specifically had yet to release, which was that same year, later on in the year, even after Dark Souls, which is the open world that brought it to an astronomical overabundance for the next couple of years. As you can see from this particular forum right here, the term open world and intertwined world are used interchangeably quite liberally in the same post. So I think it's just that, a mix of the telephone game, the term maybe not being as strictly defined, or perhaps just a mistranslation or misunderstanding somewhere down the line. So I think it's unlikely that, unless it was literally just a misunderstanding from the marketing team, that it was strictly described as open world, given that Miyazaki answered a question shortly after the first descriptions of the game and even the first trailers, which are all in early February, by the way, where he pretty much clarified that it wasn't going to be something like Oblivion. But in that same interview, as I said, Miyazaki revealed that they wanted to do something like that for Demon Souls, but they couldn't quite get it quite yet, which is understandable. And lastly, of course, we got Demon Souls. Be nice to her. Again, still not super far away from all of these, but still a decent gap. Maybe this is too much of a gap. Maybe, let's say right here is where I would give it, Demon Souls, and then maybe right there, Dark Souls 1. But it's hard to kind of, on the fly, try and do it even. Now, as I said, I think this might be one of the most controversial entries here. I feel like people could even put it like before Sekiro or something, but, I guess depending on how much the distance would be, it was kind of varies too. But here's why I think it's this right here. So you start out, you got Vanguard, then you are forced to do Phalanx to start off as a kind of second tutorial, more formal tutorial. And then for me, you can continue on to Tower Knight, but here you are blocked for a while to go into Penetrator. So what you have to do is go to another world. So you can do Armored Spider, Flame Lurker, into Dragon God. You can go into Fools, into Man-Eaters, into Old Monk. You can go into Adjudicator, into Old Hero, into Storm King, or lastly, you can go into Leechmonger, to 30 Colossus, to Estrella. And then if you do any of these, you unlock the pathway into, so this Penetrator, and then the Faucillant. So just looking at this, it might look a little familiar. From the very beginning of the video, we have a 5-way pathway you can take to do the progress, which is to, well, in reality, you can do all of those, and then only do Penetrator, and then Allant. And then only then will you unlock the way to true Allant, which beats the game. So, in some ways, you can say that this is the most open world save for Elden Ring, of course. Now, as we discussed in the last entry, because of the Dark Souls 1 comparison and stuff, we know that all of these are disconnected. So that gives a small little hamper to my definition of open world, because by definition, it isn't an open world. It is levels. It's like Mario 64 or something. And this realization, the thought process, almost made me move it back. Unsure where, I don't think I'll put it behind like Sekiro necessarily, but it did maybe consider moving it back. Until I remember in Metal Gear Solid 5, Phantom Pain. That world is similarly broken up into levels and kind of things, and you can't go from like one mission to another seamlessly, which maybe is kind of what they wanted to do at first and they didn't for, you know, drama reasons, whatever, doesn't matter. But it is very frequently described as an open world, despite the fact. And that is obviously mostly because of the elements of freedom to it. You can tackle the missions from a lot of different angles, more so even than the previous Metal Gear games. And I don't think I've seen it often, at least in open media. Maybe there's some niche discussions here and there, saying that Metal Gear Solid 5 maybe is an open world per se. And there's so many arguments there. And that's the thing. That's the crux of the video. This is a spectrum. There's very few games that probably are considered like 100% puritanically open world, like something like Breath of the Wild, maybe even Minecraft or something. I said more to the right here. For instance, a game I mentioned that I think is hailed as a kind of beacon of open world, Skyrim, I would consider closer to Metal Gear 5 than I would Breath of the Wild and maybe even Elden Ring. Why is that? Well, if you actually look at the story progression of the story, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's not a lot of variance. There's a couple of choices you can make along the way to vary it a little bit, but you got to get like the dragon soul, you got to go into a cave, or you got to, you know, help the blades for a little bit, and then, you know what I mean? Like, I don't remember the exact process of it, but I remember it being pretty straightforward and a linear story for that. The open world aspect of it is literally the fact that the world is open, more so than like the freedom of choice of how you progress a storyline. That's a little bit more straightforward. So that, I think, bolsters my whole argument here that it's a spectrum more so than anything, and maybe it's not even defined. Like, maybe you could even make this a 2D graph where there's like freedom on one angle and then the openness of the map and stuff. Now, I could do that too, but that would be a little more complicated. I don't know, maybe for fun I could do one after in post. But I think there, for at least the Soulsborne series, there's a pretty straightforward line. Demon Souls does maybe hamper it a little bit. That's one of the only ones that could maybe go higher in the freedom scale, maybe less in the open world scale either. But for Skyrim specifically, it's more so about the other things you can do, something like Red Dead Redemption as well, which also could be in a similar vein, where The story is pretty straightforward. Maybe there's variance in what order you can do some of the quest lines, but it's mostly about the actual map being open. And the story is pretty straightforward. Just for one more example, I would put maybe Witcher 3 a little bit to the right of Skyrim, because there is more variance in the order you can take at least the beginning parts of the segment, if I remember correctly, for the story. And you can do more or less of that, of like all optional things along the way. And I think it does tunnel towards the end there, but I don't think people argue that it is open world. So like, you know, Metal Gear onward, maybe you could exclude Demon Souls, but around here, you could say all these are open world, but they all vary in how much they are open. But I would say that Elden Ring does feel more so because of the way you can kind of progress with just any 2 great runes. But it does fall off a little bit, kind of like Dark Souls 2 towards the end, where it kind of goes into a linear tunnel. But again, for that reason, I think Breath of the Wild is one of the most pure representations of an open world that we have seen, and to some degree we will see. Now, I'm not, like I said earlier, I don't think that's strictly a good thing. I do think there's things to critique about Breath of the Wild, obviously, and even about the open world aspect of it. But with all that in mind, I think that Demon Souls has a lot of openness. Like I said, you do have to do all of the archdemons to be able to progress, but you can tackle them pretty much any order outside of Alant. And even then, all you have to do is kill one of the other archdemons, and then you can do Alant as your second. So no, it's not an open world game. I mean, I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying any of these besides Elden Ring are. However, the freedom that you get from Demon Souls arguably could be bigger than Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. And I'll certainly say more than all of these. I mean, these only have a couple of ways to go. And they're still fairly linear. But yeah, I mean, Demon Souls I feel like is, like I said, a pretty good summarization of why this is more of a spectrum than anything and why it's not set in stone. Like I said, you can certainly make an argument for Demon Souls being below Sekiro just due to the fact that they're a fragmented world. And by any means, if you disagree with that placement or any of these, feel free to just tilt this on its side and do your own like linear to open graph in the comments. I will certainly be interested to see what you think. I do feel like these are partly set in stone. It's mostly this segment that I'm definitely curious about. I feel like Demon Souls might be the one that most people shift around. And maybe these two a little bit. I feel like Dark Souls 1 and 2 might have some variance in what people think is more open, because of the way where the last 4 bosses are kind of like this, more so than like interconnected, different paths you can take, like in Dark Souls 2 intro. But ultimately, if it wasn't clear, this is mostly just a thought experiment kind of thing. Just a thought I've had for many years at this point, and I just thought it'd be fun to put it in a visual whiteboard here, because editing this would probably be a pain in the ass as well. Right on time.